Faith in the Sixth Form Scene 2. On my way home that day, I knew it wouldn't be long before I earned a slippering, and that somehow, Mrs. Saunders knew this as well. Had that been part of my embarrassment? While the prospect was a little scary, I figured a slippering over my shorts would probably be less painful than one of Mother's bottom spankings. And to be honest, I was also a little intrigued by the idea. If the truth be told, from the very start I found Mrs. Saunders to be very feminine, even attractive in a certain plump manner. Her large breasts swayed heavily under frilly blouses. Her nylons swished back and forth under her full skirts, which fell gently against hourglass hips and bottom. And she always wore intoxicating perfumes which smelled of lavender and roses. As someone just staring to reach puberty, I was entranced. As my thoughts drifted off before I fell asleep that night, I wondered what it would be like to have Mrs. Saunders put me over her knee. And for the next few weeks, whenever Mother spanked me, I imagined it was really Mrs. Saunders. About 2 weeks after school started, I ended up playing baseball at the local park well past my assigned lunch time. Mother had told me to be back by noon, but I lost track of time and discovered it was 12:45 when we finished the 9th inning. Knowing I might be in trouble, I ran home as fast as I could. You can imagine my surprise when I rushed into the parlor and found Mrs. Saunders finishing up some tea with Mother. Lunch for two was waiting on the dining table. And Mother wore a severe expression which made my heart sink. "Where have you been, young man? You know you were supposed to be home almost an hour ago for lunch." "I'm sorry, Mother. I really am. We were playing baseball at the park and we lost track of the time. I promise it won't happen again." "Peter, I'm afraid a simple apology won't suffice. Didn't I warn you last weekend about getting home on time for lunch?" "Yes, Mother," I murmured, hanging my head low. "And what did I say would happen if you were late again for lunch, Peter?" "You said you would punish me, Mother." "Actually, I said I would give you a good spanking, Peter Towner, and I meant it." At first, I assumed Mother was going to punish me later, after Mrs. Saunders left. But when she began rolling up her sleeves, I suddenly became very alarmed. "Please, Mother, can't you punish me in some other way, or at least wait until later? You know better than to ask that, Peter. I told you what would happen if you were late for lunch again, but it obviously didn't sink in, did it? I would be happy to use simple warnings or other punishments if they meant anything, but they don't seem to get your attention, do they? It seems the only time you mind Mother is after she turns you over her knee. Now come here, young man. You're overdue for some old-fashioned medicine, and I'm going to give you a good dose now." Trying desperately to appease Mother, I took 2 hesitant steps toward her while continuing to plead my case in the hopes of postponing my fate. "Please, Mother, please don't spank me, at least not here." With a significant glance over at Mrs. Saunders, I begged, "Couldn't you at least do it later? Young man, don't make me get up to get you. You had better come over here right this instant. If you didn't want a spanking today, you should have come on time." I managed to take another 2 steps before blurting out what was really on my mind. "Please, Mother, not in front of Mrs. Saunders. Please, take me upstairs for my spanking." As luck would have it, Mrs. Saunders herself cast the deciding vote. "Do as your mother says, young man. Don't you worry about me. I've seen plenty of boys' bottoms before. I raised 2 sons of my own and spanked them all the way through high school." "Peter, you heard Mrs. Saunders. Come over here right now or you'll be a lot more sorry in a few minutes, I promise." At that point, I knew my goose was cooked. With my voice already cracking, I took a few more steps towards Mother and came within reach. Immediately she grabbed one arm, pulled me closer, and began scolding me like a small youngster, punctuating her remarks with hard spanks to the seat of my pants. "I expect spank you to listen to Mother spank when she tells you to do something. Spank, do you understand me, Peter? Spank, do you? Spank, please Mother, don't spank me now. Please don't spank me now. Don't be silly. From what she tells me, it won't be long before you earn a slippering at school. Now stand right here. Hands at your sides, young man. Spank. Mrs. Saunders has seen lots of little boys before. I said, hands at your sides, and I meant it. Spank, spank, spank. Patting her lap expectantly, Mother pulled me over her lap until my head hung down near the floor and my legs waved helplessly in the air. Let's show Mrs. Saunders how Mother handles bad little boys who come home late. Please, Mother, don't spank my bottom in front of Mrs. Saunders. Please. I don't want a spanking like this, please. Oh no, Mother, no. No, no, wag. Before I could get out any real protest, my spanking had begun and I quickly shifted from begging for mercy to crying like an 8-year-old. I don't know why, but I always started crying once a spanking began in earnest. Part of me knew there was no point in protesting since Mother never stopped spanking until my bottom was bright red and Mother heard real crying. It was also true that I felt very much like a little boy whenever Mother spanked me. Having Mrs. Saunders there to see me spanked on my bottom only made me feel even more helpless and I gave in to my tears almost immediately. At one point during my punishment, Mother turned to Mrs. Saunders and commented, "You see how well Peter takes his spankings, Ruth. I'm sure you won't have any trouble slippering him at school. In fact, I think you find he's very obedient once you take him over your knee. He's usually Mother's little angel after a good bottom warming. Deep down he knows he needs a spanking when he's bad and he feels much better after he gets one." I was too busy crying like a baby and kicking my feet in the air to protest these comments, especially when Mother continued spanking me the whole time. All I knew was that my bottom was on fire and nothing else mattered. After my spanking finally ended, I was sent into the corner for 10 minutes until I stopped crying. I then had to thank Mother for my spanking and apologize to Mrs. Saunders for disturbing her tea. Only then did Mother give me a big hug, tell me that all was forgiven. She even let me cuddle on her lap for a few minutes. Fortunately, my embarrassment ended when Mother announced it was time for lunch and Mrs. Saunders excused herself to run some errands. After that Saturday spanking in front of Mrs. Saunders, I vowed I would never do anything at school to earn a slippering. But less than 2 weeks later, Mrs. Saunders herself caught me with incomplete homework in her morning math class. She taught 7th and 8th grade math as well as handling administrative duties. Rather than saying anything to me in class, she simply returned my homework with an F on the front and the words, "Young man, see me in my office after school." The rest of the day was an agony of anticipation which made any concentration on schoolwork all but impossible. At 3:20 when the final bell rang and the other students climbed into the school buses, I trudged over to Mrs. Saunders' office. I knocked and entered when she called out, "Come in." Since she was busy with some papers, she asked me to close the door and remain standing for a few minutes until she was finished. Eventually, she put down her pencil and pushed her chair back away from her desk. She then stood up, removed her jacket, and placed it on a nearby clothes hanger. She then moved the chair to the empty space on the side of the desk, sat down, and began rolling up the sleeves of her silk blouse. As I stood there in the silence, growing more and more uneasy, I noticed her large breasts swelled heavily against the pearl-colored blouse and jiggling slightly with her every movement. The fullness of her breasts was matched by the plumpness of her thighs, distinctly outlined by an peach-colored cotton skirt which fell softly between them in a clinging manner. Finally, after both sleeves were rolled up and the slipper placed in her lap, she turned and began to lecture me. "I don't have to tell you, young man, why you are here or what is about to happen to you. You were warned about the consequences of incomplete homework on the first day of school and now you will simply have to pay the penalty for your laziness. I have already called your mother so she won't worry about why you aren't on the bus. After your spanking, I will drive you home and drop you off myself. Do you understand me?" Yes, Mrs. Saunders," I stammered. "One more thing. Since your problems in math go well beyond incomplete homework, I told your mother I thought you needed weekend tutoring and she agreed. It seems your previous school was deficient in the teaching of math, which explains why you have fallen behind. With weekly tutoring, we should have you up to speed in 2 or 3 semesters at most. Starting next weekend, your mother will drop you off at my house on Sunday afternoons for an hour of math tutoring at 4 o'clock. Since one of our tasks will be to review your weekend homework, I want you to complete it before you come. Is that clear? Yes, Mrs. Saunders. Good. Now then, let's get you ready for your slippering. I'd say you are lucky in that regard, given the way your mother handles you. I stepped over to Mrs. Saunders's right knee. She held both of my arms by my side and began scolding me with language normally used for much younger youngsters. Peter, you've been a bad little boy and Mrs. Saunders is going to have to teach you a good lesson with this slipper. One of the reasons your mother chose Christian faith is because we spank youngsters who are naughty. Boys and girls need to receive the same kind of firm discipline at school which they get at home. Since you have been very, very naughty to show up with incomplete homework, I'm going to give you a sound spanking now. While I'm slippering you, I want you to think about spending more time on your homework. I suppose you know what will happen to you, Peter, if I catch you with unfinished homework in the future. You're going to slipper me, Mrs. Saunders. That's right, Peter. You're going to be right back here in my office with your pants down like a little boy half your age waiting for a spanking. Now I want to hear you tell me loud and clear what you've done wrong and what you deserve. I've been a bad boy for not doing my homework, and now I'm going to be spanked. That's better, Peter. Now, I want you to be a good little boy and ask Mrs. Saunders for your punishment. Do I have to, Mrs. Saunders? Don't be silly, young man. When a naughty boy has earned a spanking, I expect him to be grown up enough to ask for his medicine. You do want to get this over with, don't you? Yes, Mrs. Saunders, more than anything else. Well then, what do you have to say? Pa, please Mrs. Saunders, please, give me my slippering now. I know I've been a bad boy and I need to be punished. That's my good boy, Peter. Since you're ready for your first spanking from me, let's get your naughty bottom over my knee. With that, she tugged me by the arm until I fell over her lap. She then pulled me over further until my feet left the floor and my head hung down on the other side. When I tried to reach back with my right hand, she seized it and held it firmly in the small of my back. In that position, I knew I was completely helpless to escape and would have to stay in place until she decided my slippering was over. Now, young man, we're ready for your real lesson to begin. While you're kicking and crying, I want you to think long and hard about what happens to naughty youngsters who come to class with incomplete homework. If I have to, I'll spank you after class every day for a week. Do I make myself clear, Peter? Yes, Mrs. Saunders. Please don't slipper me hard, please. I'll have my homework done from now on, I promise I will. I'm sure you will, young man, but only because of the good lesson I'm going to teach you right now. A slippering doesn't teach unless it's long and hard and something to remember. I always slipper until I hear real tears and see real contrition. You can kick and twist all you want, but you aren't going anywhere for a while. And with that, the first spank landed square in the middle of my bottom, across the highest part of both cheeks. After the first smack, she spanked one cheek and then the other in fairly quick succession. Each spank stung enough on its own accord. But combined into a steady stream of spanks, the effect was 100 times worse.